everyone. This is the League of Nations wireless station at Geneva, Switzerland.
Actually, you're listening to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives dedicated to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. I'm Amy Smith, and that was the voice of Brian Durin, a member of the League of Nations Secretariat until 1945 and later a diplomat, whose previous experience as an announcer and station supervisor at Radio Ariane in Ireland was particularly useful for Radio Nation, the broadcasting service of the League of Nations. We thought we would give you a little taste of media history, as this year marks the centenary of the League of Nations 1925 resolution on collaboration of the press in the organisation of peace. And we're releasing the episode today, 25th of September, the very day on which the resolution was adopted in Geneva. With us today is our honoured guest, who joins us all the way from Finland, Professor Kaarle Nordenstreng. Professor Nordenstreng is a media scholar and Professor Emeritus of Journalism and Mass Communication at the Tampere University. He started broadcasting at a very young age and became the head of research at the Finnish Broadcasting Company. After obtaining his PhD in psychology at the University of Helsinki, he was appointed professor in Tampere at the age of 30 to a new chair of electronic media, the first of its kind in Scandinavia. Parallel to this, in 1976, he was elected president of the International Organization of Journalists, which at the time was the world's largest professional international media organization. So, Kaarle Nordenstreng, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm honored to visit your platform. Incidentally, it is 40 years since I and my research assistant Tarja Seppä visited the League of Nations archives in Geneva, making discoveries to the forgotten story of the League and the press. My academic homepage in Tampere includes several publications relating to that story.
Well, thank you for having visited the archives, and it's nice to have you back here, even if it is online. So let's start with the 1925 resolution on the press and peace, and hear that text of that resolution.
The Assembly. Considering that the press constitutes the most effective means of guiding public opinion towards that moral disarmament which is a concomitant condition of material disarmament, invites the Council to consider the desirability of convening a committee of experts representing the press of the different continents, with a view to determining methods of contributing towards the organization of peace, especially by ensuring the more rapid and less costly transmission of press news, with a view to reducing risks of international misunderstanding, and by discussing all technical problems, the settlement of which would be conducive to the tranquilization of public opinion.
So having listened to that text of the resolution, Professor Nordenstreng, would you tell us a little bit more about the debate at the League Assembly in September 1925 and the resolution that was adopted?
Well, the initiative was by the delegate for Chile, Eliodoro Yanes, who addressed the plenary session of the League Assembly with these remarks.
We must stimulate among the people that new spirit which the war produced and which the League of Nations is trying to spread throughout the world. I can conceive no more effective method of forming this new spirit than by influencing the minds of people through the press and molding the future generations in the schools. Journalism has in every country but one meaning in its essence, the reflection of the ideas of liberty, progress, and morality. A universal bond of feeling unites all men and all peoples on the question of peace and the welfare of the working classes. The press is the vanguard of these ideas, and that is why I submit the following draft resolution to the Assembly.
The initiative was welcomed by a number of delegations in the Assembly. For example, Spain, Uruguay, the British Empire, as it was called at that time, France and China. In the debate, the delegate from Hungary, reminded that at the meeting of the Interparliamentary Conference in Paris already in 1900, he had sponsored a similar proposal. He reminded, and I quote, that attempt had entirely failed because it had been too ambitious. It had aimed at imposing a certain guidance to all organs of the press. This was contradictory to the very nature of the press, the organs of which were very jealous about their freedom. In appealing to press to collaborate in the work of universal reconciliation, care must be taken not to repeat this mistake. No attempt should be made to dominate the press or to make it dependent on any organ of the League of Nations, unquote. The League resolution led to a conference of press experts in Geneva 2 years later, 27, and it adopted a comprehensive program with this mandate. Again, a short quote. To the end that the work of the press may be made more effective in its responsible mission, accurately and conscientiously to inform world public opinion, and hence to contribute directly to the preservation of peace and the advancement of civilization, unquote.
It sounded very much like the freedom of the press was very important. And I also believe that there was a separate resolution on tendentious news.
Indeed, yes, there was a separate resolution focused on publication of tendentious news.
And that resolution stated that fully cognizant of the fact that the publication or distribution of obviously inaccurate, highly exaggerated or deliberately distorted news or articles is calculated to cause undesirable misunderstanding amongst nations and suspicions detrimental to international peace, the conference decided that...
Well, it ended with the following sentence. This conference expresses the desire that the newspapers and news agencies of the world should deem it their duty to take stringent measures to avoid the publication or distribution of such news or articles of tendentious news.
This was an important conference, and I believe there were further conferences of press experts later on in the 1930s, 1932 in Copenhagen and 33 in Madrid.
Yes, and they had a professional and practical character, but still they took the same political approach while declaring that the international press, to quote again, while maintaining its integral right to a fully justified liberty, intends to play its part as distributor of information by propagating only news which, in good faith, it regards as accurate and truthful, unquote. However, these resolutions, full of good intentions, were never put to practice. The mounting contradictions in the international political atmosphere paralyzed these initiatives.
But wasn't it also in these years, the early 30s, 32, 33, that the League hosted the World Disarmament Conference?
Yes, indeed. This historical conference was an ambitious exercise which resulted in a draft convention for the limitation of armaments. There, the Polish, Swedish and Spanish delegations pointed out the flagrant contradiction between the idea of disarmament on the one hand and increasingly violent campaigns of false information and open hatred intended to promote war on the other. This led to proposals regarding moral disarmament, and the Disarmament Conference even had a special committee on moral disarmament. However, despite a draft text with 4 articles intended to the convention, moral disarmament failed to get through the whole diplomatic process, and the concept remains but a footnote in history. Most interesting and also intriguing, but still just a footnote.
But this concept of moral disarmament is really quite striking, I find. Would you like to say a bit more about it? How is it understood in the interwar period?
Well, it referred to mental disarmament in the minds of people instead of material disarmament of weaponry. The word moral brought to it an ethical dimension with perspectives of humanism and even religious aspects of preserving life and well-being against death and suffering. A separate resolution on moral disarmament appealed to the press, and I quote, to contribute by every means at its disposal to the consolidation of peace, to combat hatred between nationalities and between classes, which are the greatest dangers to peace, and to prepare the way for moral disarmament. End of quote. We should also remember that the same ethical spirit was held up by the International Federation of Journalists, founded in 1926 in Paris. It initiated in 1930 the establishment of an international court of honor based in The Hague with high profile. However, it never got operative after a solemn opening in 1931 due to disagreement among professional journalists about the feasibility of self-regulation and due to media proprietors turning against it.
How interesting. But I suppose that the international climate was not particularly favourable towards it.
Indeed, towards the end of the disarmament conference in 1933, the international situation had deteriorated parallel to the rise of fascism, and this had a profound effect on the fate of the conference. Philip Noel Baker, the British statesman and Nobel Prize winner, who at the time was the personal assistant to the president of the conference, and later wrote a book on the conference and why it failed, argued that the chances for its success would have been much better if the timing had been earlier in 1930 or 1931. Noel Baker reminded that in many countries there were people who thought that the League and disarmament were utopian nonsense, since, as it was said, whatever you do, war will come. This was not only a spontaneous attitude by some people, but something that was deliberately mobilized by the military-industrial complex and other anti-League and anti-disarmament lobbies.
But all the same, the League continued its work.
Yes, it did. Despite the negative trends in public atmosphere, there was indeed progress in the League in the 1930s regarding what was called modern methods utilized in the cause of peace, referring to film and radio. The first manifestation of these media emerging outside the conventional press was a so-called cinematography. Film was considered as an educational method within the framework of what was called intellectual cooperation, which was institutionalized in the predecessor of UNESCO. Radio, or as it came to be called in the 1930s, broadcasting, was the main modern means that captured the international politics in the League. Here, like in film, the point of departure was the educational use of the medium. In 1931, the League Assembly passed a resolution suggesting the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation to carry out an inquiry on the educational aspects of broadcasting. This inquiry should cover all the questions raised by the use of broadcasting regarding good international relations. The resolution, boosted by the moral disarmament, led to a 5-year process, which culminated in 1936 in the adoption and signing by 28 states the International Convention on the Use of Broadcasting in the Cause of Peace. This was a remarkable convention at the highest level of international law, the first directed straight to the content on media, moreover adopted at a time when the Second World War was just approaching rapidly. In fact, the collapse of the League itself was a few years ahead. The convention became one of the last diplomatic achievements of the League, and it remains still in force today within the post-war context of the United Nations, although Cold War turned it more or less into a dead letter. It stands as one of the few lasting elements which have survived from the pre-war League.
Let's return then to the resolution on the collaboration of press and the organisation as peace, which was adopted unanimously in the League exactly 100 years ago. How should we view this in a broad historical perspective?
I see it as a remarkable landmark. Although it was just a resolution of good intentions instead of a proper international convention or treaty, its significance boils down, in my mind, into two general points. First, it connects the content of the media to peace, making a link between these two politically delicate topics, and especially touching the sensitive issue of media freedom. Second, it elevates media to the highest level of international relations, making them an integral part of international politics.
Those are two very important points. Professor Nordenstreng, I'd really like to turn the conversation a little to your life, because you found your voice so very early on in broadcasting. In fact, I believe you were only a 15-year-old schoolboy at the time. You also studied psychology, and at one remarkable moment in 1961, you interviewed Carl Jung, not long before his death. And so, with your permission, I can't resist letting our listeners hear a glimpse from this extraordinary interview.
I'm human. I'm not a machine. I don't respect machines.
But machines are everywhere today.
Yes, they can be everywhere. Flea and lice are everywhere. Flies, for instance, are everywhere. I don't pay respect to them. I don't allow them to dictate my behavior. If I think only takes staged arrangements, that is no good, and it is only useful when it takes nature as it is.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. We have some linguistic troubles also in Finland because they do not understand your English speaking. I must everything translate.
Of course, yes.
And
so why don't you have a gadget that translates? It's too stupid. You see, you cannot even translate.
The gadgets are able to translate, as we know. Nevertheless, I believe that Jung's cynicism about technology against human presence over 60 years ago is very valid, still in the contemporary world.
It is indeed. It is indeed. Your own career moves between scholarship and broadcasting and has echoes of what the 1925 resolution was pointing towards, the press as a vehicle for peace. You had such a fascinating career, both as an academic and as an activist in international media policies. And in the 1970s and 80s, there was the so-called great global media debate and even information war around the New World Information Order. Would you like to point out some highlights in that history?
Well, this would invite me to another full podcast, but let me pick out just two historical events with direct links to the 25 League resolution. First, Mass Media Declaration of UNESCO, adopted by consensus in Paris in 1978, after years of hot debate. I have written a book on its preparation and significance, but here just one detail. Its long title reads, Declaration on Fundamental Principles concerning the contribution of the mass media to strengthening peace and international understanding, to the promotion of human rights, and to countering racialism, apartheid, and incitement to war. Incidentally, you find the whole declaration by Googling UNESCO Mass Media Declaration. The original proposal of the declaration by Bielorussia spoke about use of mass media, which can be understood to suggest outside guidance of the media. And this made Western free media advocates suspicious about supporting state control. In the drafting process, the word use was replaced by the word contribution, which suggests a voluntary participation of the media. I can disclose here that this was my suggestion while I served in a hidden drafting group assisting UNESCO's Director General to search for a compromise. Actually, collaboration applied in the 25 resolution would have also been quite flexible better than use. But in the 70s, I did not yet know the resolution, which I discovered only in the mid-80s. On the other hand, collaboration suffered and still suffers today in the post-war world from a negative connotation after it was associated to Nazi collaborators. The second case from my adventurous past takes us to year 1982, when the UN General Assembly in New York held its second special session on disarmament. While outside, in the streets of Manhattan, hundreds of thousands of people demonstrated in support of peace and disarmament. The main UN plenary hall had one day allocated for international non-governmental organizations to present their positions on disarmament. And I was speaking on behalf of the IOJ, which I was presiding at the time. I was in that session the only one from the media field. Actually, to my knowledge, the only media representative who has ever spoken from the UN General Assembly podium.
Well, I really do think that we should let our listeners hear an excerpt of your address at the UN that day.
The professional journalists today, no matter whether they are working under the sophisticated conditions of the industrialized countries or with all the hardships of underdevelopment, or even in the middle of a liberation struggle in Palestine, Southern Africa, Western Sahara, El Salvador, and so on. All the same, they increasingly realize that we are faced with a struggle towards a new order and that the struggle is one, however great is its variety. But the journalists have gone further than analytically observing the situation. A significant development has taken place in the ethics of the profession, as demonstrated by a declaration given 2 years ago in Mexico in the name of the international and regional non-governmental organizations, which unite as many as 300,000 professional journalists from all continents and various political orientations. This is what they declared, among others, and I quote, "A true journalist stands for the universal values of humanism, above all peace, democracy, human rights, social progress, and national liberation, while respecting the distinctive character, value, and dignity of each culture, as well as the right of each people freely to choose and develop its political, social, economic, and cultural systems."
The Mexico Declaration quoted here was further refined in the next meeting of the International and Regional Organizations of Journalists in 1983 in Paris and Prague, and adopted with the title International Principles of Professional Ethics in Journalism. It was another remarkable document, closest to the idea of a global code of ethics that has ever been achieved anywhere. Let us recall that this was still Cold War time of the 80s, when the world was divided between East, West, and South. Still, the international movement of journalists was closely cooperating in the spirit of so-called détente, and it was possible to reach such achievements as the global principles of professional ethics, like it was possible also to reach some steps in disarmament. Paradoxically, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, and the world, including international movement of journalists, was disintegrated, and a common professional fraternity remained a dream far from being materialized.
How do you see it today? Are you suggesting that the world is not more hospitable towards ethical and peaceful initiatives since then in the 1990s?
Unfortunately, I do. Listening to my UN address in today's reality makes me to nostalgically reciting the song, "Those were the days, my friend." We should remember that in the 1980s, a strong movement for peace and disarmament was sweeping throughout the world. It was the same kind of atmosphere that inspired the League of Nations after the First World War, with landmarks such as the 25 resolution. Also, media scholars were participating already since the 60s, when Johan Galtung published his article on the structure of foreign news in the Journal of Peace Research, followed by a momentum of peace and war journalism after the Persian Gulf War at the end of the last century. In the new millennium, much of this tradition has been forgotten. International law has played a diminishing role in the media research and journalism education, while the agenda of the field has been determined by expanding digitalization and lately by artificial intelligence. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and the protracted war has pushed both media and societies in the direction of militarism, away from a peace orientation of the 70s and 80s. Also, looking at Gaza, Israel, and the rest of the Middle East, not to speak about the developments in the United States, with trends away from a rule-based international order of multilateralism, on which the United Nations was founded, following the model of the League of Nations. All this opens deplorable perspectives. Nevertheless, I would still see hope in the confusing world, and even say that today the legacy of the League and its products, such as the resolution, which we are celebrating today, serve as vital sources of inspiration for a better future. We should not fall in despair and keep thinking whatever you do, war will come. After all, it is possible to construct a new page in history.
I'm so glad that you still see hope and that you find sources of inspiration that we can take from this period in history and the work of the League. But after this long experience that you've had in research and media, what message would you like to leave our listeners with beyond that?
In brief, my message would be radical, go to the roots with the classics such as Aristotle and Confucius, Marx and Mill. Focus on values and objectives, not only to mechanisms and means.
Those are very good and wise words to conclude with. Professor Nordenstreng, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. Very enjoyable.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure and honor to be on this platform.